Good evening, First Minister.
Good evening.
We are delighted, of course, to have you here. And I'm going to say the same thing to you as I'm saying to all the party leaders. The aim is to allow time for our lovely audience here, who've got lots of questions, lots of opinions already, to put as many points to you as possible. So I'd be grateful if you keep your answers brief and to the point. And forgive me if I interrupt you.
Of course.
If you don't. So let's take our first question for Nicola Sturgeon from Shirley Duncan. Where are you? Yes, Shirley Duncan.
Sturgeon, if there's a hung parliament, what is the price of your cooperation with a minority government?
Well, obviously it's a very good and relevant question for everybody across the UK. The SNP may well hold the balance of power in a hung parliament after this election, and let me say we will use that influence, if we have it, responsibly and in the interest, of course, of standing up for Scotland, but also in the interest of progressive values for people right across the UK. Let me be very honest, I could not, in good conscience, ever put Boris Johnson into number 10 Downing Street. Because I've seen the misery that Tory policies have heaped upon people. Jeremy Corbyn may not be my choice of Labour leader, but I don't get to choose the Labour leader. So in terms of what I would seek to win from a minority Labour government, obviously I would ask for and expect Jeremy Corbyn to respect the right of the Scottish people to choose their own future, because it's not for Westminster to decide, it's for the people of Scotland. But I would also want an end to austerity. I would want to see an end to the misery of universal credit. I would want to see an NHS protection bill so that our NHS cannot be put at the mercy of Donald Trump in a trade deal. I would want to see fairer pensions for our older people. The UK has one of the lowest pensions in the OECD. So these are the progressive policies that the SNP would champion. Yes, for people in Scotland, but also for the benefit of people right across the UK. OK, well, let's come back to this independence referendum, what you talked about already at some point. We've just heard the Labour leader saying that he would not offer you a second independence referendum for at least 2 years of a Labour government. You said, or you have said many times, you want to do that next year. So how's that going to work? Well, you know, firstly, let me explain my position and then I'll perhaps speculate on Jeremy Corbyn's, if I may.
Well, you don't need to speculate, because he told us right here, so would you accept it?
Speculate on what his position might be after the election as opposed to what he said here today.
Oh, I see, OK.
But my position is one of principle. There'll be differences of opinion in this room on Scottish independence. Of course, there is a difference of opinion in Scotland on Scottish independence. I would not be asking Jeremy Corbyn to support independence, but simply to accept the principle that that is a question that should be decided by the people of Scotland, not by Westminster. Now, I guess if I can turn to the position that I think Jeremy Corbyn might take after an election, I've heard some of what Jeremy Corbyn has been saying to you this evening. He spoke with a lot of passion. I don't agree with him on everything, but I do agree with a great deal of what he was talking about public spending, health, austerity.
So, but the key thing is he said not for the first 2 years.
Yeah, but that's the point I'm coming on to. I'm asking you, having heard Jeremy Corbyn, do you think he's going to walk away from the chance to end austerity, to protect the NHS, to stop universal credit, simply because he wants for a couple of years to prevent Scotland to have the right to self-determination? Jeremy Corbyn supports the right of self-determination for almost every other country in the world. I'm not sure he's going to compromise the chance to have a Labour government for that issue.
So you think he's saying one thing to our audience and to everyone at home, and he's going to be saying another thing to you privately?
Look, you're putting it maybe more bluntly. I will be more diplomatic.
Just calling it like it is.
But the point is, I lead a minority government in Scotland, so I know the compromises that you have to make to govern in that situation. Of course, he's putting a manifesto forward, but if he's in the position of needing the support of the SNP, then I think he will choose to do some of the things that are in his manifesto, and I don't think he'll turn his back on that in order to block the right of the people of Scotland to choose their own future. And I'd ask you to make your own minds up on that. The man here in the front.
So are you saying that you would prioritise the Scottish independence referendum over ending austerity?
Look, I want the Scottish people to have the right to choose their own future, because fundamentally for Scotland, we've put up with... Scotland hasn't voted for a Conservative Westminster government for 60 years. But for 36 of those 60 years, we've had to put up with a Tory government. We are facing being taken out of the European Union against our will. I want Scotland to determine our own future. But in answer to your question, I will never put a Tory Prime Minister into power. I grew up in the west of Scotland. I saw the damage. I grew up in the Thatcher years. I saw the damage that Tory governments did to Scotland, and to communities across the UK. I will never support a Tory government. But if Jeremy Corbyn wants the support of the SNP, I don't think it should surprise people to hear me say that I would ask him to respect the right of the people of Scotland to choose their own future. And I don't think he'll turn his back on ending austerity in order to block that right.
OK, well, you heard it here, folks. I'm going to take a few questions, if you don't mind, and then perhaps you could answer them in a row. Yes, the woman here.
Hello, yes, good evening. At the moment, the talk is that the UK government are focusing too much on Brexit and negating other issues. But don't you think that's happened in Scotland? You know, Jeremy Corbyn actually just brought up that social inequality is huge. I know that knife crime in Glasgow particularly is a big problem. So you not think by leading with Scottish independence, you're actually negating other issues, like the UK government are doing now with Brexit?
OK, let's take a couple more before you answer. Yes, the man here.
Sorry, similar, I suppose. But just around if there is a Labour government that you are supporting in coalition, then and that Labour government takes us through a second referendum and we don't leave Europe, given that the Labour mandate does correspond with yours quite so well, will you still be pushing for a independence referendum for Scotland?
And just the man at the back.
Over the past few years, we've all borne witness to the farce of a Brexit negotiation. So if Scotland were to get its referendum and it were to win, what guarantees could you make to the rest of the Union that we wouldn't see the horrible result of the Brexit negotiations with the toing and froing of the hard borders and customs unions and things like that?
OK. Lots of different questions.
Okay,
You'd like to try and address them.
I will try to do it as briefly as possible. On the question, very good question, about are we prioritising independence over other issues, I would say that the evidence says no. Don't get me wrong, Scotland has challenges. All countries have challenges. As First Minister, I face challenges in our public services every single day, and my job is to confront those. But if you look at some of the policies, if you look at some of the policies in Labour's manifesto published this week, if you take things like free prescriptions, free university education, restoring the nursing bursary, opposition to fracking, for example. These are all things that my government in Scotland has already done. So we're getting on with delivering those progressive policies, but we want to be in charge of our own future, not to turn our backs on the rest of the UK. We'll always be the closest friends and neighbours, but so that we don't get dragged down paths by Tory governments that we don't want to go down. The second question on if there is a second EU referendum and the UK votes to remain. I hope that happens. I've campaigned and worked as hard as possible, as has the SNP, to try to find a way for the whole UK to stay in the EU, because I think that's the best future.
And then you won't need to call for a second independence referendum, because there won't be the material change that you talked about last time, which you need, according to yourself, to have one.
The case for independence doesn't rest solely on Brexit. Brexit is one example. It's a very extreme example of the way in which Scotland is treated with contempt, often by Westminster. And we've seen that over the past 3 years. We've tried to compromise, we've tried to find ways to protect Scotland's interests, and that hasn't happened. So I think Scotland does need to make that choice about taking our future into our own hands. And thirdly, because this is a very good question about, will independence be as difficult as Brexit? And, you've probably noticed this. I oppose Brexit. I think Brexit is a big mistake. But what I don't think is that the mess that Brexit has become was inevitable. That was down to the fact that the Brexiteers, if I can be undiplomatic for a moment, told a lot of lies, on one of them on the side of a bus. It was down to the fact that there was no honesty or frankness about the implications, no planning done in advance, and then Theresa May came out with all these contradictory red lines that could never be reconciled. Contrast that with the independence referendum in 2014. Whether you agreed with the proposition or not, there was a very detailed proposition. We'd done the work, we'd done the thinking, we had a whole transition programme ready to go had the result gone the other way. So I don't think we should allow the Brexiteers, who made such a hash of Brexit, to tar all positive change with their brush. They messed it up. It doesn't mean others have to mess it up as well.
And you want a confirmatory referendum on Brexit? Would you also want a confirmatory referendum on your independence deal by the same token?
That is actually connected to the answer I've just given, because the reason why
I didn't hear that answer. Would you want a confirmatory referendum on your independence deal?
If you let me answer it in my own terms, if I may, because I was drawing the contrast between the mess of Brexit and the different approach taken for independence. I don't think it was inevitable that Brexit was a mess. Therefore, I don't think it was inevitable that we were in the position of having another referendum.
So would you want a confirmatory referendum?
Because I don't think...
OK, so you want a referendum for Brexit, second one, but not for your independence deal.
The point I'm making is I don't think the position we're in right now with Brexit had to be like this. That was down to the bad planning, the lack of planning, which I don't think the proponents of independence would allow to happen.
Can we hear from Rebecca Ferguson? There you are.
So I'd like to know, irrespective of maybe if we leave the EU or not, if you are denied by government a second independence referendum for Scotland, what particular action will you take following that decision? And whether that's because they've said no, or whether because maybe Jeremy Corbyn's government are dragging their heels and it's going on and you were promised but you're not quite getting it, what action will you take?
Well, you know, people understandably ask me that all the time, and what I say, and I know it sounds like a typical politician's way of avoiding the answer before I say it, is...
Oh, no, we don't want that.
Well,
not tonight.
I know, because I genuinely don't like to answer questions that way, but if I come to that point, then I'll set out how I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. And yes, I've thought a lot about that, but I don't want to talk about that right now, because that is me conceding that these Westminster politicians actually have a right to block Scotland's ability to choose our own future. And actually, we're in an election campaign right now, and people in Scotland have an opportunity to send a very clear message that they want to be in charge of their own future, and that's what I'm asking them to do.
But the government does have a right to block it. Your government has the veto on it. You know
well, I don't think they've got a moral or a democratic
they have the
right
legal
to block
right to do it.
the right. Well, it's never been legally challenged, but I've always accepted, and I continue to accept, that the transfer of power is necessary and desirable. But I don't believe they've got a moral or democratic right. And we're in an election campaign, and there's an opportunity for Scotland to make that abundantly clear.
Surely if, obviously, you said you were trying not to give a politician's answer, because it would be almost conceding defeat, like they had a right to block the will of the Scottish people. But surely for people in Scotland, it would give them confidence that you will see through what they want if you actually set out your contingency plans for if it's denied to you. Surely you would want to bring Scotland together and actually tell them, actually, we are our own country, we have a right to determine our own future, and this is what we will do if we are denied it by this way.
No, I think that's a fair point, but what I'm saying to Scotland right now, and as I said, if I come to that point, then I will set out exactly to people in Scotland what I think we should do then. But what I'm saying to Scotland now, in a general election campaign, is we have the ability to send that message and make that view and that voice very clear, and that's what I hope people in Scotland will do for that reason, but I also hope they'll vote SNP so that we can contribute to all of these other social and economic policies that I've been talking about.
OK, there's a few hands up. Let's hear from the man there in the blue sweater.
In the 2014 referendum, the EU turned around to Scotland and said if they voted for independence, we'd be classed as a third state. So they'd be out basically voting to leave the EU in a sense, and they'd have to rejoin as an independent nation. How would you get around that? You argue that you're so against Brexit and so on, but surely your own independence is another form of Brexit. And also, alongside that, Scotland has the issue of its deficit. How would you get Scotland's deficit down to levels that would be acceptable for the EU to admit you? And you've got the issue of Spain. Would Spain admit you when they've got their own issues with separatists in Catalonia? Like, how will you get round that?
So Scotland has the largest deficit in Europe at 7%. It needs to be 3% or less in order to join the EU.
Can I take the gentleman's questions?
Yes, I'm just expanding on what he's saying.
There's a lot of questions in there. Let me try to take them in turn. Firstly, with the greatest respect, Europe didn't say that in 2014. Europe didn't make any comment about what would happen if Scotland voted for independence. It certainly didn't say that Scotland would not be allowed to be a member of the European Union. Some may have taken from their body language, they weren't that keen on it, but they didn't actually say that. Nor has Spain ever said that it would veto the membership of an independent Scotland. What Spain has said is that if it is done constitutionally and legally, they would respect that. And, you know, I travel a lot around the European Union, and there's been a sea change in attitudes towards Scottish independence since Brexit, both in the institutions and in member states. The European Union, since it was first established, has sought to enlarge itself. I think the idea that it's going to try to kick out or not allow in part of a member state that has been there for 40 years is kind of inconceivable. On the deficit, can I firstly make this point? If you exclude London, because London skews a lot of the economic calculations for the UK, Scotland's deficit is not out of sync with the rest of the UK.
But the thing is, London is in the UK, so
okay,
I mean, what's the point
in terms of, because Scotland is often treated as an outlier, London is actually the outlier and Scotland is in line. But that is, we'll leave that point to one side because I can see I'm not convincing you on it.
Well, what about you? But I mean, it doesn't really matter if it's convincing me.
Well, okay, but the other point is Scotland's deficit is falling. It fell by £1 billion in the most recent year. Our onshore revenues went up by £3 billion. But my more fundamental point is this. If the argument against independence is that Scotland has a big deficit, that is a deficit that has been accrued under the Westminster system of governance. And if we've got a big deficit because of that, that's not an argument for Scotland staying the same.
So, what responsibility do you take for that?
Well, I don't control, as First Minister, the macroeconomic policies of the United Kingdom. I wish I did in some respects, but I don't. So Scotland does not take all of the decisions in our own government that govern these things. But the point I'm making is, if you look at independent countries similar in size to Scotland all over Europe, they're richer, they're more prosperous. Why shouldn't Scotland, with all the natural and human and social resources we have, be capable of emulating that if we have the powers to do that within our own hands?
The man in the check shirt.
Nicola, who ever promised once in a generation referendum?
Well, look, you know, democracy.
Who ever promised it? I hear it from Boris Johnson, I hear it from Corbyn. Who actually promised once in a generation?
Look, if Brexit hadn't happened, do I think right now, I would still support independence, OK? I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But do I think right now we'd be standing here talking about having another independence referendum so imminently? Probably not. But circumstances have changed dramatically. And in a democracy...
Did anybody say promise?
In a democracy, when circumstances change, people have to have the right to change their mind. And if they don't have that right, then I don't believe what we're living in is a democracy. Now, I can't force Scotland to choose independence, just as I can't force the UK to stay in the EU, but I do believe we should have that choice so that whatever path we take as a country, whatever kind of country we are going to become, it's one we've chosen ourselves. It's not one that we've had the likes of Boris Johnson decide for us.
But was the word promise used?
By who, sorry?
Exactly.
Well, look, people said in 2014...
Did anybody say promise?
Not to my knowledge.
No, but Boris Johnson keeps repeating it.
Okay.
Jeremy Corbyn keeps repeating it.
OK, we hear you.
Okay.
I think you've had your answer. Let's hear from a few more people in the audience. Yes, the woman there with the glasses.
So, in terms of the fact that Scotland needs to reduce its deficit in order to be allowed into the EU, does it therefore not make sense that independence wouldn't be a priority and Jeremy Corbyn's policies of putting more business and more infrastructure into Scotland should happen first so that you then can get into the EU?
And do you mind if I take a couple more points? And then, yes, the man here sitting right by me, I can't miss you.
Thank you. Nicola, our grandparents fought and died to protect Britain and the United Kingdom. How would you explain to them your desire to break up this country?
Yes, if you'd answer those two, please.
Firstly, on the point of EU membership, I mean, Scotland, whether we're in or out of the EU, wants to get its deficit down to sustainable levels. Most countries across the Western world have deficits, and we've set out plans to reduce that. It is reducing already. It's not a condition of joining the EU to meet those deficit levels. I want to see more investment in Scotland from whoever is in government in Westminster, which is why I've set out the policies that the SNP would want to see pursued. But our experience of Westminster governments over a long time is that investment doesn't always come. It's always also the case that if you want in Scotland to deprive Boris Johnson of a majority, then the way to do that is to vote SNP, because we're the main challengers in every Conservative seat. On the issue of our grandparents, my grandmother was from the north of England. I've got many family members in England. believe in independence so that Scotland can be self-governing. But the closest ties of family, of history, social ties between Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland will always be close. And I don't believe independence for Scotland is turning our backs on that. It's simply making sure that Scotland is in those relationships on the basis of equality. And I think that's a good and positive thing for Scotland. And actually, I think it would have benefits for the rest of the UK as well.
Let's take a question now from Stephen Whitelaw. Yes.
First Minister, on domestic matters, last year there was over 1,800 drug-related deaths in Scotland, the highest in Europe. We are 3 times more likely to have a drug death in Scotland than elsewhere in England and Wales. What are you doing about it, and what needs to be done to reverse this trend?
Well, that's a very good question. Firstly, some context for that is you're probably aware. Scotland, because of our sort of disproportionately high drug use back in the 1980s, there's an ageing cohort of drug users that have other health conditions, which is one, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons for that rising number of drugs deaths. It's a public health emergency. It's not acceptable. What we are doing about it, we're investing more money in drug treatment services. We've established a task force made up of experts, but also people with lived experience of drug use to look at the different, more innovative things that we need to do. Power over the classification of drugs is still held at Westminster. One of the things that Glasgow City Council is wanting to do, and we're seeking the power in order to do that, is to establish in Glasgow what's called a safe consumption room, so that we can try to reduce some of the harm related to drugs. But this is one of the most important issues that we're facing in Scotland, and I think there is a real I know there is a real determination, but I think it exists across parties to do absolutely that.
The figures just now indicate that on trend to actually be higher this year. I think there's 500 odd drug deaths this year to date in relation to it. So is the policies working just now?
There is more to do. So some of these policies will be starting to have an effect, but it will take longer in some respects. So I'm not going to stand here and make promises about that I can't necessarily deliver in the year timescale that you're talking about. What I can say with absolute conviction is that there is a real determination to tackle this and to do what is required over whatever period is required. I don't want, not just to be First Minister of a country, I don't want to be a citizen of a country in which we've got people dying unnecessarily of drug use. So we are determined. If you take alcohol misuse, for example, which is not the same, we've implemented, for example, minimum unit pricing. So we've got a record as a country of doing really courageous things when it comes to public health, and we've got to show that same determination here too.
Is Jess Booth here somewhere? Is that you? I was trying to, because I know you have, from the questions you submitted, you have personal experience of this.
I do, yeah. Hi, I am a recovering addict. I had an issue with benzodiazepines, and in the report that the gentleman's referenced up there, you talk about older, people who have been through drug-related things in the 80s and things like that. But actually, one of the biggest contributors to the rise in deaths is around benzodiazepines and the amount that they are just prescribed to people who are in alcohol withdrawals or who are suffering from anxiety, suffering from mental health. And there seems to be a real lack of education around what these drugs can do to people and how quickly it can ruin your life. I came to the brink of death on these drugs, and I'm one of the lucky ones, and I feel like there is a situation that's not only being not really looked at properly in Scotland, but also throughout the whole of the UK.
Yeah, no, I think that is absolutely right. And given your, excuse me a second, given your experience, if you were willing, I would love to talk to you a bit more and perhaps put you in touch with some of the people within the Scottish Government that are working on this, because it's really important that we do listen to people who have experience so that we can learn from that and make sure that the policies we're taking forward properly reflect that. So if you are willing to leave your details there, I would love to follow that up. Yes, the woman here.
If you were in a coalition government, what would you do to make sure that those outside London are better represented in Westminster, not just Scottish people?
Well, that's a very good... Can I just clarify firstly, not to dodge the question because I'll come on to it. I don't envisage being in a coalition government with Labour. I think it would be a less formal arrangement than that if we're in that situation. But, many of the areas of England suffer from much the same neglect as Scotland does, and much the same contempt from Westminster as Scotland does. So the SNP will always try to stand up for decentralisation from London. Much of what we've been able to do, because we have a Scottish Parliament, some of the policies that Labour are now promising in their UK manifesto, I think with more power, with more devolution to some of the regions of England, would be possible there as well. So the SNP will always be a voice for decentralisation and more powers to be spread around.
So how much, so if you were in some kind of agreement, confidence supply, whatever it might be with a Labour minority government, should that come to pass, how much involvement do you see then, from that question, the SNP having in affairs south of the border? Do you see yourself actually getting stuck in terms of the laws that are passed for the rest of the UK?
No, we would always respect. So we are responsible in Scotland for health policy and education, for example. I don't think it's right that we would seek to, no more right than it would be for Westminster to dictate to Scotland that we would dictate health policy or education policy in England, except where that affects Scotland, because often the decisions that are taken around Westminster on the health service, for example, have implications for our budget. And one of the big issues in the next Parliament, potentially for the health service, is trade deals. And we all have to come together, those of us who don't want our NHS sold off, to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we will seek to exercise influence, of course, in Scotland's interest, but where it is appropriate, in the interests of people right across the UK.
The man here.
Hello. You've talked about economics and the deficit, and I know Scotland relies a lot to, because in order to have your freedom, you're going to need money to do this. And you mentioned resources, and the North Sea is one of these key areas that is often raised. Is it not important to let go of that now, to strand those assets and grow the natural resources like wind and tidal that Scotland is doing so much, and raise the money that way rather than the oil and gas industry?
In a word, you're right. I agree with the sentiment. So if I've got the time just to slightly unpack...
You've got about a minute, I'm
Scotland
afraid.
is already... Around about 80% of our electricity comes from renewable sources already. If we were to stop oil and gas production tomorrow, we would become more dependent on imports, which would actually increase the carbon footprint. So we've got to have a managed transition and a just transition. That transition is underway, rightly so. We've got to accelerate it. We've got a net zero target in Scotland, in law already, of net zero emissions by 2045. That's 5 years ahead of the rest of the UK. So we've got to power on with these things, and we're absolutely focused on doing it.
Right. Well, there's been quite a few questions, but we, for the moment, are out of time. So, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.